Hey, and welcome to today's episode talking about the physiological origin of FTP or functional threshold power. Let's get straight into it. So I assume that most of you will know the term FTP or actually use it in training, test it, use the results to derive training zones. And I assume that most of you will train and try to improve your power output or running speed or whatever measure of intensity at functional threshold power. So most people know or have kind of an idea of what FTP is, right? But what's about the question not what it is, but how it's actually generated? What determines the power output at FTP? And why does one athlete have a power output of, let's say, 200 watts, and another athlete has a power output of 300 or even 400 watts? What is the difference? What are the mechanics that determine power output at FTP? And that's what we're going to look at in this video. What we want to start with is understand where the term FTP is actually coming from, or functional threshold power. So I think it's important to understand, no matter what definition you might be using, 60-minute power output or whatsoever, we come to this later, is that your functional threshold power is kind of the functional substitute or the more applicable, more training applicable substitute for a term called anaerobic threshold. An anaerobic threshold has been out there in the world of exercise physiology for decades actually. It's a much older term than threshold power. And in most cases, anaerobic threshold will be determined by lactate profile tests. You would have to visit a lab or a field test, but you basically increase, that is kind of the traditional protocol, you basically increase exercise intensity, stepwise, 3-minute, 5-minute, 8-minute steps whatsoever, measure the lactate concentration, and then use whatever kind of method to derive calculate the power output or running speed at anaerobic threshold. So what FTP actually is or is trying to do is, without the need to go to a lab, try to determine this domain of intensity which relates or correlates or is actually your anaerobic threshold power. And because it is not the real physiological correct scientific way to determine an anaerobic threshold, it is called functional threshold power, because it is the functional value of this threshold you're looking for. Okay? But the real origin, so where it all comes from, is a term called MLSS, which stands for maximum lactate steady state, right? So back in the mid 70s of the last century, 1976, the first publications came out describing that at a certain exercise intensity, the lactate concentration would be stable. So if you look at time, minutes, most likely in most cases, and the lactate concentration, at a certain intensity, the lactate concentration in the blood, measured in the earlobe or in this time actually at the finger, would stabilize. And when you increase the intensity, the lactate concentration might still stabilize, but on a higher level. And at a certain intensity, lactate values would not stabilize anymore, but kind of increase. And then the maximum lactate steady state actually basically refers to the highest intensity, the highest power output or running speed, at which it is still possible to maintain a constant lactate concentration. Okay? And again, this is then what anaerobic threshold or FTP are trying to do via a lactate profile test or via whatever kind of test using, power data these days from your bike or a run. And what might be interesting to know is that the differences, so the jumps in intensity from this lactate curve to this one, normally you're looking at changes of approximately 10 watts. Okay? In some cases, maybe 7. So that's an important side note, because it basically tells you that even with this gold standard, So this MLSS is the gold standard to determine the real threshold, so to speak. The resolution is never better than approximately 7 or 10 watts, maybe depending a little bit on the body weight. Okay, so even with this gold standard, it is not valid, it is not correct, so to speak, to even discuss changes in power output at threshold smaller than this. And then obviously this is also true for any approximation of this metabolic state. Okay, so long story short, what we're looking at here with talking about functional threshold power is trying to be an approximation of an intensity domain where lactate still stabilizes. Okay, and why lactate? Well, view lactate as a marker, as an indicator for fatigue. Not saying that it causes fatigue, right? But you know, at exhaustion, an athlete reaches a certain lactate level. And the steeper this curve, right, the sooner the athlete will reach his individual maximum possible lactate concentration. Basically saying intensity is higher, fatigue occurs sooner. Now, obviously, this gold standard maybe is nice in terms of accuracy and scientific reliability and so on and so forth, but it's most likely, in most cases, you would use durations of 30 minutes. So whatever, 30 minutes 280 watts, 30 minutes 290, 30 minutes 300. You can do maximum 2 of those on one day, so you can already see it's not very practical, right? It's not really applicable to training. You have to go to a lab and you would have to go several days. And obviously you need to know where to look, right? Do I start here with 280 watts or 380 or 180? So not really applicable, not really useful for application in training. Therefore, incremental lactate profile test, determine anaerobic threshold, or the more training applicable way, forget about the scientific one, use the functional threshold power. Maybe good enough and actually very good usable. So this is where the term FTP comes from. It is actually linked to being able to sustain a certain lactate concentration. The highest intensity which can be sustained without accumulating lactate. This is, historically speaking, what FTP is trying to approximate here.